Hello and welcome everyone to the panel Policy, Translation and Translators. At this conference, I'm very happy that we can have this panel here online now. It's a panel that Patrick Hassenteufel and I organized, so from the University of Versailles, Saint-Quentin Paris-Saclay in France, for Patrick, and for myself from the University of Magdeburg. Before we start this panel, I would like to very much thank you, Osmani, for organizing this conference, and also to Miva for all the technical assistance and help, and also for the coordination, because it was not easy to come up with a date for this panel for our very international presenters that we are inviting here today and that we're hearing from. The idea of this panel on policy translation and translators, it's actually based on a chapter that Patrick and I wrote together on policy translation and translators that will be published in the handbook from Osmani on policy transfer and diffusion and circulation. I believe next month, so we are very excited about this. And in that chapter, we seek to engage with the theoretical debate about translation and combine both our empirical work on translation processes to illustrate our analytical framework. But enough about our work. We are very excited now to hear about your work on policy translation. And we have three very interesting papers in this panel. And before we start, let me briefly explain how we're going to proceed. So each presenter has about 15 minutes for presentation. This will be followed then by a short comment based on your presentation and based on the papers that you sent us. And then we will have some time to discuss your work together. And all in all, this panel should take about 1 hour 30, maybe 1 hour 45. But yeah, to be a bit early, because our next panel, session 2, will start at 18 GMT. So we want to have a short time in between. This is why we're gonna finish a bit early. All right, so we're going to start with the first presentation following the order as announced in the conference program on the politics of translation of the climate adaptation agenda in Brazil and Colombia. That will be presented by Carolina Milhorans, who is a research fellow of the Brazilian Network on Global Climate Change and Regional Development Group of the University of Brasilia. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, this is the classic problem. Sorry. I hope the presentation is being shared and everything's fine. Only the mic was the first issue. So good afternoon, everyone, and good night for those who are the Northern Hemisphere in France and Europe. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present our research. I'm really glad to meet you virtually and see the faces of some of my colleagues after such a challenging year. And also glad that Osmani managed to organize this conference online, which is a huge challenge. So thank you very much for that. So the work I will present was developed with my colleague in France, Fanny, who is here to help me to answer the questions, Brazil and also Colombia. We changed a little bit the title. So just an introduction. Climate change is an emerging challenge for the world, as you know, and the adoption of both mitigation and adaptation strategies by national policies is the most recommended approach. So while this is it's a very classic concern and very classic issue for policy transfer studies, and it has been consistently and considerably addressed by research. However, the process of policy mutation, the implementation methods, the distinct framings, and the concrete results, in other words, the process that go beyond policy adoption, have been somehow overlooked, in our opinion. And this is the interest of the study. So we align with most of the recent transfer literature, and we believe, however, that the notion of translation has been very useful in shedding light on some aspects, such as the actors' interactions, the meanings of distinct policy approach, the power relations, the iteration between levels of governance. So here we interest also in address both the type and degree of policy change related with this translation process. So there is a practical concern on this study, and a practical concern for development cooperation. But why the translation of climate adaptation? First, this is a very comprehensive concept with multiple objectives and context-dependent policy solutions, and especially when you consider the vulnerability approach, which is very broad, like other I don't know, participation is a very broad concept with multiple meanings and means of appropriation. So climate adaptation goes in the same direction. And second, it promotes a cross-sectoral strategy and the establishment of very complex portfolios and mixes of policy instruments. So these are not individual standalone initiatives. There's a lot of room for interpretation. That's why translation is a good approach to address in this case. So the study was carried out both in Brazil and Colombia from 2017 to 2019, 20 a little bit. And these two countries have been chosen because they face similar challenges in terms of climate impact, particularly regarding the rural sector. They also adopted their climate adaptation strategy at the same period in the early 2010s. And regarding the international context, the UN Conference on Climate Adaptation, it encouraged the adoption of national adaptation plans. So, moreover, the several climate disasters happened in this period. In 2011, for instance, connected to the La Niña phenomenon, and helped to raise some public awareness for the needs of adaptation strategies in this country. So we draw on existing studies on policy translation, particularly the distinction between discursive actors and institutional dimensions developed by Patrick Ulrich and his colleagues. We don't want to reinvent the framework. On the contrary, we want to contribute to this literature by providing some details to operationalize further the concept. This is the objective of the study. So we tried to go a step further by analyzing on the discursive dimension the process of framing the policy issue in each countries. And regarding the institutional dimension, we decided to analyze institutional trajectories in the process of policy adoption. Oops, sorry. We analyzed comparatively the process of policy framing of the adaptation plans in Brazil and Colombia with a focus on the rural sector, and we examined the actors involved, the concepts and the strategies that have been privileged in each case, and the institutional settlements upon which these plans were established. So very briefly, because I don't have enough time, in Brazil, the process was led by the Ministry of Environment with the ambition of bringing together and influence other sector agendas. But in the end, each chapter of the plan was developed by a distinct group of actors with divergent interests as well. So mainly official actors like ministry representatives, but also representatives from research, civil society, and private sector with their particular interests. International funds were used to finance the elaboration process that took 2 years, but their role in the decision-making was marginal. And each chapter promoted a different adaptation concept and a different policy solution. They are very divergent under the same framework. For instance, the chapter on biodiversity and vulnerable populations put forward that advocates for a concept, the concept of ecosystem-based adaptation. And the strategies connected to this concept were strategies of deforestation control, a protection of indigenous lands, while the chapter of agriculture on agriculture promotes the idea of climate smart agriculture, low carbon agriculture. This is an international concept which endorses initiatives of productivity increase, technological development, and is directly opposed to the agenda of deforestation control, the common control initiatives. And finally, the strategy, the chapter on food and nutritional security, disseminates the notion of resilience and strategy of agroecological development and the reduction of social vulnerabilities, which are explicitly written, explicitly opposed in the strategy, the notion of climate smart agriculture. So in Brazil, we see a juxtaposition, a layering of divergent concepts and strategies in the same policy framework, which actually reflect the existing sector policies established in the country, just adding some climate concerns. In Colombia, the process was very different. A national body under the president of the Republic was mandated to develop the adaptation plan from a cross-cutting perspective. The ideal world, however, this body, the Department of National Planning, did not involve in the concrete elaboration of the strategy. So the broad vision was based on the idea that climate adaptation would be a national development strategy in the context of peace agreements taking place in the country and repositioning the country in the international arena, and some of the same concepts promoted by the international actors found in Brazil, like ecosystem-based adaptation, resilience, and climate-smart agriculture. They were promoted in the design of each strategy in Colombia as well. However, these were mainly designed by international consultants with lower relation of the national policies. And at the end of the day, these were employed without much reformulation, appropriation. They did not reflect practical solutions, except for the plan developed by the mining sector. In the mining sector, the notion of resilience was actually combined with the idea some sustainability standards to access international markets and to promote some regional, territorial level initiatives. So the routes, the paths that each countries are distinct, but both reflect the national politics and policy-making patterns of in each country. And to reach briefly the conclusion, the results of this process were, in Brazil, the layering of existing sectoral policies with new adaptation goals, in the case of Brazil, and in Colombia, an actual proliferation of new policy documents adopting all the international concepts and led by a high-level institution, a high-level policy framework, however, with no concrete strategy or actual means of implementation. So in Brazil, on the contrary, the implementation was assured by all the sectoral ministries, which were already responsible for each group of instruments, but it reflected the traditional policies, and the climate goals were only marginally included in the layers on the top of the existing established policies. So at the end of the day, we see a minor incremental change in policy framework in Brazil, and a change at the normative level in Colombia. But in both cases, the achievement of adaptation goals remains very problematic. We wanted actually to reinforce the need to emphasize some aspects such as the institutional trajectories, the objects, and the degrees of change, of policy change related to translation. I think many studies are still at the level of policy adoption, but as we see in Brazil and Colombia, this the national adaptation strategies were adopted with the same concepts, but the actors involved, the results in terms of implementation and in terms of combining the interests of specific actors are very different. And I think the translation framework helps us to shed light on this difference and better capture also the actual results at the national and subnational levels. And finally, in a broader debate regarding climate policy, while the process of layering and drift, which we observed in these two cases, are more likely to produce incremental change or even prevent change, the climate change challenge requires major policy change and significant effort to alter policy priorities, cross-sector power asymmetries, and means of implementation. So, as the UN indicator for adaptation progress is mainly focused on the adoption of this strategy, we have to go further and to include all this need for policy and balance and asymmetries involved in the process of translation, and also the meanings and interpretation of the concepts in practical solutions. So thank you very much. I'll be here to answer all the questions. And Fanny, who is my co-author, will be helping me with the questions as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Carolina. So now, Patrick, it's up to you to comment on the paper, and then we can start the discussion.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you very much for the presentation and for the paper. The really very interesting case, a comparative case for which the translation perspective seems to be really relevant. And I like very much in the paper the way you draw a framework, a translation framework to analyze this policy by having this distinction between content, between the content process and the output, and that helps to show that there are different levels of translation. What I found also very interesting in the paper and the presentation is the link you stress between translation and policy change, and so that translation is not necessarily does not necessarily lead to policy change, and you shed light on the limits of policy change in both cases, even if those limits are different. And this is also a very interesting point of your research, the difference between the two cases. So that's my understanding. If I understood you right, in the Brazilian case, we have a very path-dependent process, and even if there is some implementation, there is implementation, but without a lot of change, and with a limited change and a very incremental change in Brazilian policies. And in Colombia, we have more change in at the level of content of policy formulation, related to a stronger role of international actors, consultant and international organization, but less implementation. And it's in a way it's a kind of a formal translation, and a translation without implementation. So it's a very really interesting cases and showing these different levels of translation. So my main question is about the way you explain the difference. So so you stress that you don't have the same kind of actor at the national level leading the adaptation process, the same kind of administrative actor. On the one side, the Ministry of Environment, and in Colombia, the Department of National Planning. You also stress another difference, that the fact that there are a lot, that the interest groups and NGOs are a part of the process in Brazil and not in Colombia. And another difference, a third difference, is that international and transnational actors are playing a role in Colombia and apparently not, or much less in Brazil. So the question is, are these differences are kind of an explanatory factor, but how can you explain this difference in the actors involved? And the other question is, finally, who are the translator? Are they the leading the leading administrative actors, or especially in the Colombian case, the international and transnational actors? So that's not very clear for me. And also a last question, more specific to the Brazilian case, is the role of interest group and NGOs. They seem to not to play a role in policy change. Does it mean that they are already a strong part of the sectoral configuration in Brazil? So maybe the last remark I want to make to be not too long is that you use the notion of policy drift, of layering, based on the analysis of incremental policy change. But I'm not completely convinced by the use of that notion, and especially the notion of drift in the Colombian case, but because it doesn't really stress that the main one of the main results is that there is no implementation in Colombia. So that's my remarks and question, and thanks again for your very interesting paper and research.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Patrick. Carolina, do you want to respond to that note?
Yes, I can respond. It's working. Thank you very much, Patrick, for the comments on the development of research, but also the points which are not very clear yet. Yeah, still working on the project. And I will start answering and maybe switch also to Fanny, who can help me with the Colombian case. So who are the translators? Is yes, it's a very important question, and I hope it will be clear in the presentation of the text, at least. They are mainly official bodies, the ministry. In the case, in Brazilian case, we have the Ministry of Environment, who is responsible for establishing this national adaptation plan. So they have the role of framing what is adaptation to Brazil at this point. But at the same time, the framework is composed of different sectoral strategies. And this is the very problem of this kind of strategies. They are cross sectors. So we have the Minister of Environment trying to lead the process, but they have to influence all the sectoral agendas, and they have to write strategies for each sector, and which is supposed to be combined strategies, but they are not combined in the end of the day because of the reasons I exposed before. They are different actors translating or develop or framing what is the adaptation to each agenda, to each sectoral agenda. So in the case of, for instance, food and nutritional security adaptation strategy, these are mainly the Minister of Agrarian Development, and ancient Minister of former Minister of Agrarian Development, who doesn't exist anymore, the Minister of Social Development, and some NGOs, Oxfam, for instance, who helped to actually write this strategy to present what they understand by adaptation. So their meaning, their understanding of adaptation is much more related to the idea of resilience, the idea of agroecology development, of the idea of hydric security. So there's their vision related to the policy they are implementing or advocated for is the way they frame and they translate this. So there are very many levels. I think you have this broad framework, the national framework, national adaptation plan, but they decline in sector strategies, so have other translators at this stage. And if you go at the territorial level, we didn't reach territorial level in this paper, but we do this work as well. If you reach the territorial level, there is another group of translation. For me, this is at the very interest of the translation. The translation framework is this iteration between different governance levels and the different actors translating at each level. So this is the case in Brazil, and in Colombia is the same. We have this department, national department planning. I forgot the name. Sorry, funny. We'll precise. But at the sectoral agendas, we have other actors translating. Mostly in the case of Colombia, these are international consultants, except for the mining sector. In Brazil, no. In Brazil, and I come to the second question, which was what explains the difference. You're completely right. The actors involved in the process explain the difference. So the actors, how they engage, they are chosen by governance. So you lead this process, and also in the process of a formulation of these strategies, but also the institutional framework behind this. Not only the actor, but behind the process of translation and framing. So in Brazil, there is a combination. I'd say different interested groups are present in the state bureaucracy, and this, in the rural sector, this is very clear. We used to have Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Agrarian Development, with different visions of rural development, of agriculture development, and involving different interest groups. For instance, the Minister of Agriculture is very close to agribusiness actors, in BRAPA, the economic actors, while the Minister of Agrarian Development is very close to social movements, grassroots movements, agroecology movements. So this is institutionalized in Brazil. So the institutional organization of the state also contributes to explain these results. And we try to enter on the politics of this interaction between actors, but interaction inside the state. In the case of Brazil, and interest groups. And the drift layering, and I guess the last question regarding the institutional trajectories. I think the idea was to provide some guidance. This is not an explicative factor, but some guidance of how things work, how things develop in a dynamic, from a dynamic perspective, dynamic institutional trajectories. And in the case of Colombia, for instance, I think the drift was explained by, first, drift is the multiplication of strategy. We change the policy goals, the policy ends, but not the policy means. This is one of the definitions of drift by Howlett, for instance. I think it's a very good definition, and he explains the Colombian case, because they change all the objectives and the policy in itself, but they don't change the implementation means, the methods of implementation. And it's also a way to for us to understand the different paths. I think you can simplify it if you look from an adaptive climate policy perspective, or international perspective. We can see delaying, for instance, will not promote a major change. It would be much more of a dependence strategy. The drift would get lost on the multiplication of documents, which is very common in international development strategies, while we are more interested in maybe reaching true change, which is much more explained by the conversion and design institutional trajectories. This is a way of characterizing the process, not explaining the change, but just so we can at least position ourselves in the debate. Maybe Fanny have something to add. I'm monopolizing the floor.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Carolina, for the great presentation. No, I think you answered very well all the questions. So I agree with all your answers. So yeah, in terms of actors, in the Colombian case, yeah, we are speaking about the international consultant that were sent into the ministries to formulate the adaptation strategy, and using the concept that were promoted by their organization to formulate those plans, those sectorial plans. So yeah, you explained it very well, and yeah, I agree with the concept of drift. What we observed in Colombia, yeah, is a multiplication of plans following the international trends. First mitigation, then adaptation, then integration of both adaptation and mitigation, but no specific resources to develop these plans, no resources to implement them. So yeah, you anyway, you answer very well. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. Before I ask you my question, I want to read out the question that Osmani put in the chat, speaking about that he was thinking about the relation between translation and resistance. And he would like to ask that, can we say that there was a resistance in Brazil to translate according to international standards? I think this is a very interesting question. It's also related to, linked to what you already said. And it's also, when I was reading your paper, I very much enjoyed reading about your very interesting case studies, the comparison, but also the conceptual framework. And I found the Colombian case also very interesting, because you say there is a kind of bureaucratic endorsement and a change at the normative level, but at the same time there's no real implementation and the same means here. So this goes in a very similar direction as Osmani's question. So is there also a sort of circumventing actually to implement international norms and standards by using the same language and without really contributing to actual change here, just using another language?
Thank you once again, Osmani. It's a very interesting question. I've been working on this kind of question for other case studies as well. In terms of resistance in the Brazilian case, I would say, first of all, the climate policy in Brazil lost weight in the past years, not only adaptation but also mitigation. I think almost everyone here is aware of the dismantling process taking place in Brazil, not only on climate policy, but on rural policy, health policy, and several sectors in the culture. But looking at the first steps on the development process of this policy, we can see there is several kinds of resistance, but in the first there's institutional and budgets, also budgetarian resistance, because the adaptation agenda was second ranked compared to the mitigation agenda. So there's much more budget, much more importance, international importance and relevance for the mitigation agenda, which is concerned with the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. The adaptation agenda is a second level, let's say, agenda in Brazil, and not only Brazil, but international climate regime. So there is this distinction. Even in the Ministry of Environment, the adaptation agenda was a secondary agenda. So there is some lower importance at the same time. And for that, other ministers wouldn't change their budget lines, the planning strategies to actually incorporate the adaptation concerns. And so they decided to just put everything they had already together and say, okay, this is adaptation. We just add some climate risk management strategies, but this is adaptation. So there is this kind of resistance. But at the same time, a very interesting point that I saw in Brazil, it's that how the agribusiness groups were in the beginning much more concerned with the adaptation agenda. So there is a low carbon agriculture plan. It's a major plan to tackle climate change in the rural sector in Brazil, and is much more promoted by agribusiness actors because it establishes credit lines for these groups. But at the same time, the mitigation, the low carbon, the mitigation agenda was very close to the deforestation control agenda. So, and these groups are very opposed to this kind of strategy. They just don't want to show any kind of command and control strategy. They don't want to look at deforestation control because they are responsible for the deforestation in many states in Brazil. So they started to see that on the adaptation agenda, they have this opportunity actually to promote technological development, to promote productivity increase with a more positive narrative than rather than the deforestation control, the command and control agenda. So there's resistance, but also support that we wouldn't realize in the beginning, and they are starting to change positioning regarding these different climate strategies. So I think it's we have to follow all these paths to really understand what's being implemented and changed and by whom.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't see any questions here yet, so I suggest that we continue with the second paper, and then we will have a discussion about all papers at the end. So thank you again, Carolina, for your presentation. Okay, so the second paper is from Lara Gauthier. It's on a conceptual review of terminologies designating influential policy actors in global governance. Lara Gauthier is from the Department of Health Management, Evaluation and Policy of the School of Public Health of Montreal University.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. And so I'm going to put my presentation in full screen. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this session. So this is some work that I had done for my PhD thesis, which is now dating back from 2018, 2019. So I will try to also bring some updates if I'm able to in the discussion later. And a part of my PhD thesis was about reviewing concepts that are used to designate those influential policy actors acting in global governance arenas. And so the product of this work is presented right here. So as you know, there are many designations for those influential policy actors, starting from the most famous epistemic communities and policy entrepreneurs, which I'm sure everybody here knows about. And then there are many others. There's policy translators, which this session is about. There's change agents, transfer agents, knowledge entrepreneurs, knowledge brokers, development brokers, etc., etc. So I will be reviewing almost each of these concepts for this presentation. But just to give a little bit more background, so there are all of these multiple concepts to designate those actors. But what's also interesting and what made me want to review them a bit more critically is that there's also an added complexity of contemporary global governance arenas, which is about multicentrism. This concept has been developed by Paul in a book that he published in 2019. It's a bit of a mix between multi-level and polycentrism. And I find it really insightful and interesting, and because it features, well, both the fact that, of course, policy actors can have influence at different levels of jurisdictions, but it's also the realization that polycentrism makes the entrance of non-traditional policy actors possible. And this is why I find it quite interesting to use this lens to do this critical analysis of available concepts. So starting with Epistemic Communities, which has been developed by Peter Haas in 1992, the main attributes of those communities are that it's a network of professionals with a recognized expertise and competence in a particular domain and an authoritative claim to policy relevant knowledge within that domain. There's an emphasis on belief systems in that definition and in those attributes for epistemic communities, and that also brings out the analytical value of the concept. It's explicitly also applied to the context of global governance. This is why I find it quite interesting. And experts sharing a common belief systems guiding the formation of communities is very central as a characteristic. And it also features this concept power relations, which is of course very important in the context of global governance. It also has some limitations. It only features a collective vision for those policy actors, so it would kind of dilute individual leadership in that. And also the concept of epistemic communities does not provide a taxonomy of power, whether it's power to do something, so like resources, or power over other bodies of influence, which would be translated into authority. Moving on to policy entrepreneurs, the main attributes is, of course, the focus originally laid out on individuals, but it was later expanded to organizations. Kingdon says that policy entrepreneurs are advocates who are willing to invest their resources, time, energy, reputation, and money to promote a position in return for anticipated future gain in the form of material, purposive, or solidarity benefits. So there's really the notion of interest and motivation behind that definition. And the main analytical value, I think, is the entrepreneurship that is featured in the concept, in the name of the concept itself. And entrepreneurship is envisioned as the ability to couple streams, those famous streams for towards policy agenda setting and using windows of opportunity. And that is also why I think entrepreneurship in the context of polycentric governance is quite it's a concept interesting to also highlight. It has some limitations because it really features, even though it has later expanded to organizations, it's really much more focused at the individual level, and it has a Western anchor. It's not clear as to how and to what extent it could be applicable to southern actors or southern configurations of policymaking in the context of global governance. Now, another concept that has gained a lot of traction is the one of transfer agents, developed by Diane Stone. Its main attributes is that it encompasses individuals and organizations, including non-state actors, which is something I think new that she adds to the body of literature. And it features, most importantly, transnational networks, which are very influential in the context of a multicentric governance. And it's envisioned to also feature the opposition between soft policy transfer and hard policy transfer. So it's quite interesting in that sense too. The analytical value of the concept is that it prominently features the role of transnational networks, as I was saying, and it also offers a typology of modes of policy transfer, including ideational, institutional, and networks. So I think it's really a concept that's of great interest. It also has some limitations, including the fact that belief systems of those transfer agents are overlooked, and transnational networks are not, I think, vehicles of policy transfer, but also a very active actor of such transfer. And I think that might be missing from the description of that concept, according to Diane Stone. And now policy translators, which is a concept developed by Michel Calon, which also I'm sure most of you know about. So the main attributes is that it encompasses individuals and networks, including different actors that actually end up entering into a dialogue around a common problem presentation. And that dialogue can be activated through negotiation or conviction. And so what policy translators are doing is that they're seeking those actors who may have an interest in actually pushing for a policy option, for instance. I think the analytical value of that concept is that it features prominently actors' motivation and interest, the power relations as well, and the changes in the discourse through such negotiation or conviction, which I think is quite interesting. The limitations is that it does not provide a specific taxonomy of power, either on resources or authority. It also has not been much used outside of national and subnational jurisdictions, so its application to global governance is not particularly clear. And then the last concept that I will be reviewing here is the concept of development brokers, which has been developed by Jean-Pierre Olivier de Sardon and his colleague Bierschenk. The main attributes is that it encompasses individuals, networks, and organizations, so the three most prominent actors, I would think, of global governance arenas. The broker's role in the author's original vision is strategic mediation activities between different policy actors pursuing different objectives. So in that sense, it's quite similar or related to the concept of policy translators that I just reviewed earlier. It's really about the possibility of developing an interest in collaborating with each other among those actors. And what's interesting about that is that what those development brokers are trying to do is adapt their discourse to match that of development donors, the ones that are influential in global governance arenas, and the ones who are pursuing political and material objectives as well. So the concept itself features motivation as well as power relations and socialization. I think the concept of socialization is a very important one in that particular context. And some of the limitations that I found is that it emphasizes problem representations, but also not the broker's own representation systems, which is quite similar to the limitation that we can identify for Diane Stone transfer agent concept. So based on that review, we had some reflections in my research team, and we thought that it would actually be interesting to introduce a new concept. Yes, really, because and those entrepreneurs, agents, networks, organizations, etc., are not only creators and promoters of policy changes, but they are actually also active architects of the diffusion, and they have an interest in being such active architects of the diffusion. So they do that through the development of a strategic apparatus, which I find that most of scholars have not specifically developed, and so that is why I also sought to design in my own PhD work, and again they have clear interest in diffusion outcomes as well. So we decided to design a new concept, which is called Diffusion Entrepreneurs, with different characteristics, including focus on their representation systems, their own representation systems, which is matching their culture, whether it's institutional culture or individual culture, as well as their background or training. Also featuring power through resources, social knowledge resources, material resources, etc., and types of authority, whether it's expert authority, moral authority, and so on and so forth, in the context as well of North-South power imbalance. Still keep in mind that we are talking about global governance arenas, of course. And what we wanted to feature is their entrepreneurial leadership. Meaning their ability to engineer a creative policy solution and sell it to others everywhere. Also using the possibilities that are opening through multicentrism, for instance, through transnational networks, etc. So really, polycentrism and multicentrism are acting as drivers for their possibility to actually develop this entrepreneurial leadership. And the strategic apparatus that I offered to develop encompassed all the activities that diffusion entrepreneurs are acting on to foster the diffusion of their preferred policy. So that's their intermediate objective, which also matches their representation systems. And this strategic apparatus includes, for instance, policy framing, valuing lay knowledge on the policy, and sharing selective policy evidence in multiple fora. I have developed that much more at length in my PhD thesis. So if you're interested, you can also look at this. And of course, the expected effects of such apparatus will reveal diffusion entrepreneurs' motivations, which can be financial, professional, etc. And that's really that ultimate objective that diffusion entrepreneurs are pursuing. So this is the graphic representation that we offered for the diffusion entrepreneurs framework. So you have at the top of the graph the representation systems of diffusion entrepreneurs, their motivations, which then translate into strategies building on their authority and resources, and providing different options for fostering policy framing, fostering policy emulation, policy experimentation, and policy learning as well. And all of that is very dynamic and fits one another through the different possibilities of acting at the global, continental, or national and subnational levels, and also through, of course, the vehicle of transnational policy networks. So based on that, a way forward that we also suggested in the discussion of my PhD thesis is the whole debate about decolonizing public policy literatures. I think it's really important to, at this point, identify tools to document and elicit power imbalance among policy actors of the Global South, especially in the context of global governance arenas and analysis of that. And I think the Diffusion Entrepreneurs framework does that through featuring the types of authority that Northern actors can have, as well as their resources in comparison to, for instance, other actors based in the Global South. And I think there's also a need to go beyond Western-grown policy models through challenging the universality of public policy concepts, such as policy entrepreneurs, and as well as acknowledging epistemologies of the South and other forms of knowledge. So I think this is it for today. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Lara, for your excellent presentation and also for your paper, which I really much liked reading. Your presentation and paper was about a review of concepts, and I found this review of the literature actually very rich. And you presented the concepts from policy entrepreneurs to knowledge brokers to transfer agents and change agents. You could also have mentioned a couple more. You say there are so many out there, like boundary spanners or governance entrepreneurs, to add some more. And I also found the tables that you presented in your paper very useful to give an overview and to structure the very different debates out there in literature. But you didn't stop here. Instead, you presented and suggested the introduction of a new concept in addition to all that's out there already, the notion of diffusion entrepreneurs. And you say these are agents that are active architects of diffusion who are different from the whole variety of concepts already being out there. And I have to say that, well, you asked that question yourself. I have to say I'm not really convinced that we need another concept here yet. What I find very interesting is that you define the very different strategies of policy framing, policy emulation, policy learning, and policy experimentation. And you say what makes them specific is they are acting transnationally, and they have a sort of entrepreneurial leadership and so on. But I wonder if these different strategies, motivations, and also their characteristics, features of acting transnationally, of being in a way also by being architects, being also creators and promoters, having a certain objectives in the diffusion process. If we really need a new concept here, or if this is not actually covered already by the notion of maybe transnational policy entrepreneurs, as Diane Stone introduced, for instance, and used. So I'm not sure here, but I would certainly agree with you that it's important to take into account the different power relations, that this should be at the center of our focus here. And it's worth expanding the conceptual work by emphasizing the context of also the processes and epistemologies in the South, and to think about the our analytical frameworks in that perspective. So I found this a very interesting approach. I have to say I don't really understand yet. So how is the concept of diffusion entrepreneurs contributing to that objective? And maybe a last question would also be at the end of your very interesting paper that I enjoyed reading, is you mentioned that it would be very interesting to empirically test the concept of diffusion entrepreneurs. And I was thinking of, wanted to ask you if you had some empirical interests or studies already in mind where you would like, or what you would see as very interesting case studies to look at it. And maybe also one last notion is what I found when I read your the different concepts you mentioned. Basically, we're looking at those actors being very very prominent and very visible in translation and diffusion processes. And I was wondering if you were also interested or looking at the relationship towards those actors that are not so visible, that are somehow under the radar, maybe not so yeah, so at the front row, but nonetheless very important actors in diffusion processes that are sometimes captured by the notions of invisible brokers or passeurs in the context of also global governance that might be an addition.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting questions. Thank you for asking those. So I will start by your second question, because I didn't emphasize that in my presentation, but actually my PhD thesis was to empirically test that framework. So we did test it empirically on the case of performance-based financing diffusion in the Global South. Particularly taking the African continent as a case study, and also looking at the national level with the context of Mali. So it has been empirically tested. I know that there has been some other students at the University of Heidelberg as well who will be testing that framework on strategic purchasing diffusion as well in the Global South. So it has already kind of been picked up by other scholars, but I do agree that it's not so obvious that yet another concept really makes sense. What I think my concept is not only my concept, but the framework that I developed in close collaboration with my research team was really to try and synthesize all of that literature that's already out there, and already providing some answers. Not only, sorry, my partner is actually answering the door at the same time. So not only synthesizing the evidence that I presented in that review and the different concepts that are out there, but also trying to see how we can bring all that together, and emphasizing also the strategic apparatus, which was not really offered in any of the concepts that we reviewed. I mean, most of them really focus on the characteristics of the policy itself, or the belief systems of the communities or entrepreneurs or brokers that are pushing for those policies. But there wasn't really any concept or framework that was really bringing together all the pieces. And most importantly, again, the strategic apparatus. No roadmap for action for that was available in the literature for this type of for analyzing this type of actors. And I think it's really interesting to use the policy transfer and policy diffusion literatures in that sense, because there's a really extended body of literature on that as well. And so I think it's important to also try to value that sort of evidence and body of literature that's already existing. So that's the main reason why we still thought that it was important to kind of bring together all of that, all of those bodies of evidence to provide something that would be really comprehensive. And then about the prominence of actors, and trying to also look at what other perhaps not as visible actors would be doing. It's quite interesting. I think that because of our empirical testing, we really focused on those who were really at the forefront of the diffusion of that policy. But what we highlighted was that those actors were also very proactive in training other diffusion agents diffusion entrepreneurs, in other parts of the world, so that those second generation diffusion entrepreneurs could, in their turn, become prominent actors as well. And that was very clear, at least in my case study on the diffusion of performance-based financing. But I think it would be interesting to also emphasize perhaps other types of actors as well who are very active. We try to look at the influence of international consultants. That's also we're also conducting some work on that. Those consultants, I know that the team who presented before me, they also looked at their influence in policy translation. So I think yeah, the role of policy consultants in global governance arenas is also something to consider. Thank you. Other questions?
Yes, there are other questions. So there is a question from Osmani in the chat, and he would like to know, I will just read it out. Lara, if I understand well, in your presentation, you mentioned the need to go beyond concepts developed by Northern scholars, but you discussed only concepts by researchers from these countries. Why? And then there's also Patrick with a question. I'm not sure. Would you like to ask that now, Patrick? And then Lara can answer them together?
Yeah, thank you. It's a short question, but for me, it's not very clear if this notion of diffusion entrepreneur refers to individual actors or also collective actors, or are the group of actors, and so, and more generally, what for you in this kind of process, diffusion process, but also translation and transfer, is it more groups of actors or more singular actors who, in most of the case, play a key role? So I wasn't sure about diffusion entrepreneurs.
Thank you. So I will answer first, perhaps the question asked by Osmani, a very good one. I actually tried to review other sources of literatures from the Global South, and I did find some interesting papers, in general on the process of policy translation, but I didn't find, and maybe I didn't look enough, or maybe I need to update my review. I didn't find any specifics about the proposition of additional concepts that would be specific to Global South scholars as to the description of those influential policy actors in global governance arenas. So if Osmani, you have some information on that, I would be very happy to read further on this. So yeah, that's one of the things I would really like to invest time on, actually. So thank you for this question. And Patrick, thank you for yours as well. Yeah, actually, diffusion entrepreneurs are both individual and collective actors. They can be institutions. Actually, one of our diffusion entrepreneurs in the case of the diffusion of performance-based financing was the World Bank. And there are also transnational networks who act as diffusion entrepreneurs. And there was a community of practice acting online as well as face-to-face with many different activities that were very oriented towards translating and diffusing performance-based financing, that were very, very active as well in the diffusion process. So it's not only individuals, it's also institutions and networks. Policy ambassadors, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there more questions? All right, I don't see any, so I suggest we continue with the last presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation and also for this discussion. And now we have our third paper on the various lives of policy transfer, iterations in the diffusion of conditional cash transfers and participatory budgeting, which will be presented by Michel and Osmani from the Federal University of São Paulo.
Thank you, Ulrich. Thank you for having us here. I'd like to take a second just to thank Osmani for putting this conference together. I know he's been working on this for the past 2 years, and I've been following how time-consuming and demanding and nerve-wracking it can be. So, I think it's a good opportunity to thank Osmani for this wonderful work of putting us together. So the presentation for today is really a first attempt to try the waters of including the dimension of time into the analysis. We thought in thinking about, what panel we would propose this paper to, we thought that this panel would be a great opportunity in trying to engage with the policy translation literature, which I'm still not convinced we're doing it quite well. And I think, your feedback is going to be very important in giving us some ideas on how to do that best. So let's see, I'm wondering is it best that I share my screen, or is that being shared already? Okay, there you go. So I'm going to count on the support here to have the presentation. So if you can just have that on the large screen so that we can keep track on what slide we're doing. I'm not sure if that's possible. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So as you know, Osmani and I, we've been individually doing work on conditional cash transfers. I have a book on conditional cash transfers. Osmani has a book on participatory budgeting. And it really called our attention the fact that these are what we call policy models that have been, circulating for such a long time. In the case of participatory budgeting since the 80s, in the case of conditional cash transfers since the 90s. So it seemed to us that this provided a great opportunity to look at the role of time in these processes. So can you please switch to the next slide? Yes, there we go. So how can we really incorporate time into what we do? We have, through the literature on policy translation, I think this approach has really the advantage of looking at the possibilities of transformation of policy as a result of, transfer, diffusion, circulation processes. So the accommodation of the possibility of change is really important to us. But we think that time adds another dimension to that possibility of change, not only looking at how policy itself changes over time, but also how the policy diffusion, transfer, circulation also changes. So there are almost like two mutation processes occurring at the same time. And the disclaimer here is that I'm going to be using policy transfer, diffusion, and circulation interchangeably, and the same applies to the paper. Can you please go ahead? So time considered, from a different dimensions can give us different advantages to our perspective. So we can think of time from a before and after perspective, sort of a longitudinal analysis where, we observe a policy as it was before, and then as it translates and it's adapted into different contexts, how it looks after, right? But time could also be seen from the perspective of timing. So if we think of Kindem's concept of the window of opportunity, and when he says that, when the time is right, then there is a possibility of some kind of change in the policy agenda, and the possibility that a policy solution that existed before will then be picked up. So time as timing may also bring us an interesting perspective. Then we have time as rhythm, right? And the rhythm can be in terms of adoption, can be in terms of the rhythm of implementation, of evaluation, and of the diffusion process itself. So some scholars working from a perspective of policy borrowing and lending in education, they use, they get what they call the lazy ass curve, which is basically from the field of epidemiology. And I think this is something we can all relate nowadays, which is the idea that you have just a couple of early adopters in the beginning, then, you know, the diffusion process picks up very fast. But then it tableaus, right? It stops at a tableau at some point. And so that idea of rhythm, of how the diffusion process occurs with the advancement of time, and thinking about what happens after that tableau is reached. Does that mean that, you know, the policy model will continue existing for, you know, the longest time, or what happens after that tableau is reached? And finally, the idea of time from a more dynamic perspective, which is really thinking about, you know, how throughout the policy life cycle, we could have, you know, international policy models, we could have ideas and different actors influencing and impacting each stage as, you know, time goes by. So it's a multidimensional way of seeing how ideas and policy models that are available internationally could impact at the national level a certain policy at different stages. And this is sort of this more dynamic perspective is what we're trying to get at here, right? It's, you know, almost trying to think of a fourth dimension in the policy process. So we could think of a multiplicity of translations in which at any given point in time, there may be different ideas, narratives, and actors populating the policy circulation process and creating diversity of outcomes. So instead of a linear perspective in incorporating the role of time, we have a very dynamic perspective that recognizes the diversity of policy realities, of policy narratives, and of policy outcomes. So please, next slide. Thank you. So as I said, we considered that we had enough expertise to try to include the dimension of time into our analysis, considering these two widely diffused policy models. As I said, CCTs have been around since the 1990s. As I will tell you in a minute, it's a policy that has been adopted by over 40 countries. At some point now, we're down to 37, but it's still a very small reduction. And then we have participatory budgeting that's been around since the 80s. We thought that these were cases that provided this broad zoom into, you know, long existing but also largely diffused policy models. Next slide, please. So in looking at these two large cases, and large both in space and in time, we thought that there were these sort of 6 dimensions that were sort of catching our attention. The first one was that even long-lasting policy models that have been diffused for a long time still retain their value. We identified also the existence of what we're calling the millennial adopters, sort of next generations of policy adopters. We observed that very interestingly, the early adopters were actually in crisis with their own policy models. The idea of stock and flow, so how does research capture the diversity of policy experiences at not only at a certain time, but also the accumulated stock of those diverse policy experiences. The hollowing of a policy model, so how as a policy model is largely diffused, the idea or the core of what that policy is gets more and more hollowed out, and you know what's left of it is really minimum. And finally, a question about whether there is a fading global agenda that supports these policy models. And I think in this case, Osmani and I may be reaching different conclusions for this one specific element in terms of the policies that we analyze. So next slide. So for conditional cash transfers, just to give you a sense of what the policy is about, in the 90s, Brazil and Mexico had to face the challenge of reducing poverty in their own context. In the same year, both Brazil and Mexico came up with a very similar policy, which was the state will provide cash to families that are considered to be poor, and but the family will have to fulfill certain conditions, which were at the very beginning related to education and health, especially school enrollment and attendance for beneficiary families. These were not supposed to be universal policies. They were supposed to be policies only targeted at a specific population that was considered to be below a poverty line. And the conditionality aspect was very much related to the idea of building human capital, which was very prominent in the 1990s. So if you're not only providing money to the poor, but you're also making sure that the children will attend school and therefore break what was called at the time, breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. And this model has, in the past 25 years, reached about 40 countries, which is now a little down to 37 countries, even since 1995. So it's a very interesting trajectory in terms of how CCTs got globally diffused. So many of them still exist to this day. As I said, 37 with some, having these programs for 25 years. And especially considering context of developing countries and public policy in developing countries, 25 years of a policy is something that is really astonishing. There are the millennial adopters in the sense of, different from the very first countries that adopted these programs on a national and very large scale. There were then very different experiences where some countries only adopted small experimental programs with a heavy participation of researchers from the global north in a model that is what we call randomized controlled trials, right? So these were really experimental programs that were tested according to an RCT design that doesn't, in any way look similar to the adoption process in the first countries. And at the same time, these early adopters, these first countries at current times are very much in crisis. So in Brazil, there is a really strong backlash from the political right in rejecting Bolsa Familia, which is the Brazilian CCT. In Mexico, on the other hand, AMLO and his administration, even though it's a left, much more to the left in terms of its administration, has also changed the program considerably and has done many modifications that makes the program look very different from what it did in the past. So you have this reality of these programs have been existing for so long, and yet they face challenges. And then we have the idea of stock and flow, which has been a research challenge to me. I have been building this database of all CCTs in existence, and at some point it becomes really hard to define the stock and flow because there have been alternatives to CCTs that have been tried out, which are the unconditional cash transfers. And sometimes it's hard to define if they're really unconditional or if there are some conditionalities. Even the unconditional programs have not succeeded in lasting for a long time. So it seems that, the CCT model is still the predominant one in terms of being poverty reduction strategies. In terms of the hollowing of a public policy, there are only 3 elements that remain true of every CCT, which is they are targeted programs, they are cash-based, and they are conditional. Other than these 3 features, you find all kinds of variations in the existence of these programs. You find variations in terms of, how they do the targeting, how they pay the cash, who receives the cash, what are the conditions that are applied, how are these programs institutionally organized at the domestic level, and so on. So as time goes by, there seems to be, the policy becomes really hollowed out, and we can only tell it's still a CCT because it still bears those 3 features. And finally, in the case of CCTs, there is right now, I think, a question mark in terms of how much poverty reduction will remain at the top of the international agenda, as it did in the 90s and 2000s when these programs became globalized. With the Sustainable Development Goals, you have poverty still as the #1 objective, but there are 16 other objectives to be pursued. With COVID becomes at the forefront of the global agenda. So to me, there is a question about how much the international policy agenda will keep supporting the diffusion of this policy model, because initially, the diffusion process was very dependent upon the support of international actors and international organizations. So I will now pass the floor to Osmani so that he can continue the presentation.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this great presentation and the introduction. Also, thank you, Patrick and Ulrich, for accepting our paper. I'm glad to share these reflections that Michelle and I have been carrying out for the last 1 or 2 years. And I'll just follow to make coherence to our presentation. I'll follow our argument by starting with participatory budgeting and the long-lasting political value of the best practice label. So participatory budgeting has been existing for more than 30 years, and it was first implemented in Porto Alegre in Brazil after the dictatorship, and it was a policy aspiring to produce an experience of a sort of radical democracy in the city. It was implemented by the Workers' Party, the PT, and basically participatory budgeting is a public policy that is designed to include citizens in the process of discussion or deliberation of the municipal spending. What's very interesting about participatory budgeting is the high number of adoptions worldwide. So the last survey found out that around 10,000 cities across the world adopted participatory budgeting. So let's introduce our analysis by talking a little bit about the millennial adopters. So it took, participatory budgeting was implemented in Porto Alegre in '89, and it took some time to get international recognition. Our first landmark is the United Nations Conference in Istanbul, the Habitat Conference that was held in Istanbul in 1996. And by the end of the 90s and early 2000s, participatory budgeting started to be adopted in different Latin American and European leftist cities. These first adopters, they were ideologically aligned with the Workers' Party in Porto Alegre. They also carried out this view of the radicalization of the democracy, even though the emulations produced outside Brazil were showing experiences that were a little bit weaker than what we had in Porto Alegre. For example, indigenous mayors in Ecuador were adopting this participatory budgeting. Also, a city as Rosario in Argentina had a participatory budgeting. Communists in the municipalities in the outskirts of Paris, as Saint-Denis and Bobigny, adopted as well, among other cities in Italy, Spain, and Portugal. These were some of the early adopters, and this process of this first wave of adoption of participatory budgeting was also associated with a broader global process, which was connected to the World Social Forums. And a movement of the international civil society getting together and thinking about how to do public policies that would meet their aspirations. Let me move now to the early adopters in crisis, the second part of our argument. So a first threat to participatory budgeting came in 2004 when the Workers' Party lost elections in Porto Alegre. Also, a few years later, leftist mayors lost elections in cities that participatory budgeting was implemented in Europe, as in Spain, Portugal. And this produced a sort of momentaneous retraction of the experiences. However, and now I move to the third part of our argument, the stock and flow. However, this retraction of experiences didn't stop participatory budgeting to circulate worldwide, as we started to witness new waves of diffusion, with experiences mushrooming in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the Francophone countries, as for example, Senegal, Cameroon, and Madagascar, but also in Asia, and a few emblematic experiences, such as in Poland, with a national law about participatory budgeting that induced a high number of municipalities to adopt participatory budgeting, increasing exponentially the number of cases. As the process of circulation of participatory budgeting, the international circulation, continued in time, we also observed the hollowing of this public policy. And this is the fourth part of our argument. In the beginning, the adoption of participatory budgeting was kind of faithful to the idea of radicalizing democracy. However, after a decade of diffusion, this policy acquired a wide variety of meanings, from good governance to transparency, to social justice, to social control, to community engagement, and so on and so on. And this is also due to different factors. So I'm going to present two, because we don't have time to get into a lot of details. But first is that there was a high number of agents, heterogeneous agents, promoting participatory budgeting. So we didn't have anymore the mayors from the leftist parties that were promoting participatory budgeting abroad and defending this idea. But we started to have also international organizations as the World Bank, consultants, and NGOs, and especially the different generations of what I called ambassadors of participatory budgeting. This is one element that contributed to this, the different meanings that participatory budgeting was acquiring while traveling abroad. And the second element that I wanted to share here, even if very briefly, is the fact that participatory budgeting had to meet social and political and institutional specificities of the context where they were adopted. So in Spain was one type of context. In France, it was another type of institutional context, as well as political and social. And when we start to think about this broad movement, for example, and take the case of Russia or China, we have very different situations and very different meanings that participatory budgeting acquired. And finally, the fading of a global agenda, the last part of our argument. And this is a very tricky question, especially in the case of participatory budgeting, because if participatory budgeting is disappearing or perhaps already disappeared in Brazil, the last surveys of the global situation of participatory budgeting informs us that cases are increasing worldwide. For example, since 2008, participatory budgeting has been growing in the United States with important cities as New York, but also a global participatory budgeting hub was created in 2019 to help the implementation of participatory budgeting across the world. So we can observe that internationally, this is a topic that is still very important in the agenda of the cities and the democracy and those working with democratic institutions and so on and so on. And now I'm going to move to our conclusion. Please, the next slide. Thank you. So our first conclusion is that one of the most interesting things of analyzing policies such as participatory budgeting and Bolsa Família, the conditional cash transfers in general, regards the possibility for us to observe the weight of time. So we're not analyzing a transfer in a 4-year period or over a decade, but we are analyzing these experiences over almost 30 years. The second is that as time goes by, the diffusion stories become increasingly more complex. We can find new agents emerging, new space, and while old actors in old places promote new meanings. Third, there is not a single path to diffusion, but diffusion itself mutates alongside the policy model. So it's not a linear movement, but we can see that there are different scales, round-way trips, and so on and so on. And finally, translations are inevitable, and they are also a condition for these policies to circulate. And these translations do not regard only the meanings of the policy, but also the institutional design. For example, in the case of participatory budgeting, it was created in a moment where voting was done by raising hands. And now, this was in the late 80s. And now, with several experiences using advanced digital technologies, this is not the case anymore for a lot of experiences that included voting via internet or via mobile phones and so on and so on. So this is what we prepared for you today. This discussion combining two elements that are very important for us to understand: policy transfer, diffusion, and circulation. The notions and the weight of time and translations. So this is it. Thank you very much. I don't know if Michele wants to add anything else, but if not, we can open the floor for the discussions.
Yeah, no,
Michele.
that's good. Yeah, thank you. Just to thank everyone for their time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for this interesting presentation and also for your insightful paper. Patrick has prepared some comments for you, and after that we have also some questions from the audience.
Yeah. Thank you both for your presentation and paper, and I also use the opportunity to thank you, Osmani, for the huge work you did for this conference and for the online organization of that conference, and it works really well. So even if it's late now in France, but that's not a problem. Okay, it's a really interesting and very ambitious paper. You have two fascinating cases of a long time and long-lasting diffusion process, and you showed a lot of similarity to your framework, and it gives a lot of it's a very stimulating to think about what can explain such long-lasting diffusion or circulation process. And I also agree with the importance of this time issue. So I like the framework and the common patterns you stress, but I have two questions. The first one is maybe it's a comment and a question. Maybe what lacks a little bit in the paper is what explains this long-lasting diffusion process. So you give some clues in the paper, but not a more general explanatory framework, because it gives the impression that, of course, the global policy agenda plays a role. There are some specific actors like the policy ambassadors, but also the fact that this policy, these two policy instruments share the fact that they have in a way a high translation potential. They can be translated in many ways. So that's really fascinating in the case of participatory budgeting, that you can have such kind of budget even in authoritarian regimes. Maybe also, so you don't mention that in the paper, but the fact that these policy instruments are framed and analyzed as success, and this can also contribute a lot to the diffusion over time. So maybe I want to know if you have an idea, if you are trying to flesh out a kind of an explanatory model of a long-lasting diffusion process. My other comment and question is about the link with the translation, because your paper is more on diffusion than on translation, in the sense of translation at the national level. Even if you stress for both policies or for both policy instruments, you stress that there are a lot of different translation. Various translation for conditional cash transfer and for participatory budgeting, but you don't give information about who are these translators, especially the national or even local level, because the only actors you mentioned are the policy ambassadors, but I have more the impression that they are active, that they play a more active role in the diffusion than in the translation at national and local level. So thanks again for your very stimulating paper and presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And before, Osmani and Michel, you have a chance to answer this question. Maybe Carolina can add another one. Sorry, Carolina, we cannot hear you. You're on mute.
Oh, again. Sorry. This is the second time I think I did that for the whole year. 2020 passed and I didn't learn to turn on the mic. I'm really sorry. I was saying that's a very interesting presentation, this long-term perspective, because we usually only look at the a snapshot of the process, and we don't analyze what happens before and after, and how dynamic it can be, how it can change. And I have actually, it's a broad question about one subject separated into points. The first one, Osmani partially answered already, which is the I'm concerned with the global agenda. It's a very interesting point, because I'm doing my own research on this topic on food security, and how this diffusion process and how national instruments and national policies can also influence this global agenda. So I want to ask maybe Michelle, because it's the different conclusion with Osman, if these instruments can not only shape the global agendas, instead of rather than only being influenced by this global agenda, and how is this relation between this diffusion process and the influence and shaping of the global agendas. And it goes to the second point, which is if the conditional cash transfers can also be reframed in this new global agenda. You mentioned the COVID agenda, but also with the COVID agenda, I've been seeing a lot of discussion on the role of resilience of vulnerable population, resilience in the face of crisis. And at least in Brazil, there is a debate on the role of these cash transfers in increasing, in promoting resilience of vulnerable populations facing crises, including COVID. So how, in terms of the relation of the global agenda, this can also influence and reframe and be dynamic over time in influence the formulation of this agenda. And thank you once again. Sorry for the mic. I will learn it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have time for your answers, Misha and Osmani.
Thank you. Let me address these questions, and then maybe Osmani can jump in. Thinking about Patrick's question of what explains long-lasting diffusion processes, I think we were not ambitious enough to address this question at this point. Our idea was initially to sort of make a case for the importance of incorporating time into the kind of analysis that we do. But I agree that, that's sort of the second question that needs to be tackled. And I think you gave us a number of good sort of steps of where to look at in terms of the global policy agenda. Of course, the policy ambassadors that we already take into account. I think the high translation potential may be exactly the link that we were looking for in being able to work better with the translation framework. I think a challenge that we had was the translation framework works really well when you're looking at specific case studies where you have sort of a wealth of data and information to be really unveiling the translation processes. Here, because our scope was so large in terms of time and space, it makes it much harder to take the best advantage of the translation framework. And I think this is what I was missing here. So I like your suggestion in terms of incorporating the high translation potential of these two models, which I think goes well with the finding that the model becomes hollowed out. Actually, the simpler the model is, the easier it is to translate it, because then, there's just, there isn't much left to be incorporated from where the model was coming from and then be translated. It's sort of an easy kind of translation to be done. So I really appreciate that. And I like the question of who are the translators and the difference between the translators and the policy ambassadors. Because in some cases, I think it was the absence of translators that eventually made a program not succeed. So here I'm thinking of the more recent cases of CCTs in the African continent, where it was predominantly experimental programs designed by researchers from the global north, with funding mostly from the global north, and where in some situations the program did not live long. And here I'm thinking that it might be because of the absence of translators at the local level. So, you have this team of researchers that comes to a country with a predefined policy design that they want to test. They do the experiment for a couple of years, they publish a paper, and then there's no one at the local level to do the translation. And then the program dies because the funding almost also ends at some point. So I have seen a few of those examples in some places. And I think that the high translation potential, but along with the existence of translators in the national context, may be also part of the explanation of why these models have been so long-lasting. And on Carolina's question, I think it's a great question. I think you're absolutely right in terms of turning the table around and thinking of possibilities of these models framing the global agenda. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of the Kingdom's approach, and I from experience have seen how it makes a difference to have a policy solution ready to go when the moment comes. And I think that may be what may happen in the post-COVID scenario. In a way, we've already seen that happen with the emergency funds, right? So the emergency transfers, at the end of the day, they were cash transfers. They were not conditional, but they were cash transfers. In some places, they were targeted. In other places, they were not. And of course, they couldn't be conditional to education because the schools were closed. So in fact, conditional cash transfers in a number of countries at the moment are operating as unconditional programs. So the question is also, what is going to happen after the pandemic ends? And if countries realize that, the conditionality may not be needed, right? So will they remain as conditional programs, or will they abandon the conditionality aspect and just remain as cash transfers, right? So I do think the moment is a good moment to observe what's going to happen next. And it may be that even though we are in a different global moment in comparison to the 90s, I think some patterns will repeat, unfortunately, in the sense of increasing poverty levels. I think we're already seeing those indicators, going in the opposite direction that we're seeing in recent years. So with increased poverty and with the need for a quick solution, it may be that CCTs will emerge back, with greater impetus in the global stage. So thank you for your question. I think that was really engaging. Thanks. And Osmani, if you want to go next.
Definitely, Michelle. Thank you very much, Patrick, for this very interesting and insightful questions. It's true that Michelle and I would think about this together, so it's going to be interesting to answer your questions and then to come back and see how everything fits in our paper, our discussion. So you asked about what explains this long-term policy diffusion. And I can say, reacting rapidly to your question, there are two elements that were two or three elements that were very important. So first, the plasticity of the model. So we can see that participatory budgeting would contemplate China, the World Bank, and the Workers' Party in Brazil, the French Communist Party, Socialist Party, and so on and so on. So it's very interesting how the policy would captivate such a wide and heterogeneous and ideologically separated audience. So this is one element that it's very important for the circulation. That participatory budgeting was changing and adjusting a long time. If we make I like the term Carolina used asking her question. If we take different snapshots of the life of participatory budgeting, we will see that in the beginning it was those movements associated with the PT in Porto Alegre and the World Social Forum and so on. From the mid-2000s, we had a different movement, and these movements also carry different meanings. They also change according to regions. So I conducted a survey in sub-Saharan Africa about participatory budgeting, and the answers I got were suggesting that participatory budgeting was more associated to accountability or good governance and some of these keywords that are promoted by international organizations. So we can see sort of a weight of these agents as well in this moment of time. Now, if we look to participatory budgeting nowadays, we kind of forgot about the model of Porto Alegre, which became a sort of a myth of the beginning. But the new models are not looking to that experience anymore. It's very far away from our current reality. So this is very interesting to observe as in the process. What is also interesting is that in some of my discussions with colleagues working in countries very with political limitations, the word democracy is not allowed to be used while dealing with participatory budgeting. So this is very interesting for us to think about the dimension of translation and the plasticity of the model of the policy. The second is the sort of different generations of ambassadors of participatory budgeting that were changing a long time. So first, they were the mayors of Porto Alegre and other mayors, communist and socialist mayors across the world. And then it were more a group of consultants that were pushing these agendas. And then it started to become a regional, with Africa, with a few ambassadors, Asia, the United States and Canada, and so on and so on. So there are different generations of policy ambassadors that are not only pushing this agenda, but they have found in participatory budgeting, promoting and doing consultancy about participatory budgeting, working with participatory budgeting, their means of living as well. So they need to fundraise and have projects and explore new regions and so on and so on. And this also kept the thing moving and circulating. But these are only two of the elements. The other element that's very important is that the participation of and the endorsement of international organizations. The United Nations, the World Bank, also European Union at a certain point, and now the most recent agent engaged with participatory budgeting is the Hewlett and Flora Foundation. So this is very new to participatory budgeting. We didn't have this private philanthropic foundations investing on this type of experience in the past, to my knowledge. So this is the things that are keep moving the experience, pushing it further in time. The second question of Patrick is also very interesting, and I kind of disagree the fact that the ambassadors are more the diffusioners. of the policy than the translators, because they are also performing different types of translations. Among the characteristics of these ambassadors is the fact that they speak different languages, and they they're kind of cosmopolitan. They have lived or worked in they have lived in different countries or worked in different institutions, so they know well the different political environments and cultures, so they kind of know what to say according to different publics, different audiences. So this is a very important characteristic of these agents, their ability to circulate in different contexts. So sometimes they are professors, sometimes they are staff from the NGOs, and so on and so on. But often they can circulate in these different places, and they are able to sell participatory budgeting according to different audiences. Of course, they are not doing this alone. There are also other agents that are working with them that might not be long-lasting ambassadors, and this is one of the characteristics of the ambassadors, that they work with the policy for a long time, but they might have a punctual participation in a specific country, so they might help to take the policy into a specific government, and so on and so on. So this is these are my replies to and the other element that is very important for translation is the work of international organizations again, and non-governmental organizations, because they are producing the standardization of material. So they're producing guidebooks, they're producing, they're organizing meetings, they're funding training workshops, and this is very important to kind of standardize the practice for different agents to then implement participatory budgeting in their home countries and cities. I have a very nice example of this, and it is called a guidebook for implementing participatory budgeting in sub-Saharan Africa. And around 2010, maybe 12, they were produced with the support of the United Nations Habitat, 2 guidebooks to implement participatory budgeting in sub-Saharan Africa. They were called a training companion or something, and basically one was designed for Francophone Africa specifically, and the other one was designed to Anglophone Africa specifically. And these were kind of the major, the textbooks that every practitioner or civil servant that was working with participatory budgeting had to read before starting or engaging in such kind of process. So international organizations are very important agents in these translation processes, especially because they produce this standardization material and so on, and language and so on and so on. And finally, to answer very briefly the question of Carolina, which was very interesting, I think that CCTs now are much more in the global agenda than participatory budgeting due to the Sustainable Development Goals and COVID responses. But a few years ago, the United Nations Habitat prepared a document called the Global Urban Agenda. And there was an activism to include participatory budgeting into this agenda, which is the major document that is guiding urban actions worldwide. And there was this activism to include participatory budgeting in this document, and it was failed. They failed to include. And this is very interesting because they included a very soft notion of participation in this document, and they don't mention participatory budgeting. So this is very interesting how, even though this is a very strong movement, sometimes there are some battles that are not won, and this is it. So yeah, so these are my answers and comments.
All right, thank you very much for this discussion, and we are already at the end of this panel. So thank you to all the presenters for your fascinating papers and presentation. I would also like to thank Patrick, who also organized this panel and who made the discussion. And I would like to thank, of course, Osmani for setting up this conference. That was the first part of our panel on policy translation and policy translators. And we are continuing with the second panel right after this one. So see you soon.